The Victorian mansion on Elm Street had been in Sarah's family for generations, but she'd never noticed the wall that didn't quite match the others. 8 months pregnant and drowning in medical bills, she was preparing to sell the crumbling estate when her sledgehammer broke through what she thought was solid brick. The musty air that escaped carried the scent of old roses and something else, something that made her baby kick violently. What Sarah didn't know was that her great-great-grandmother had been the town's most feared witch, and this room had been her sanctuary. The police files from 1924 were sealed for a reason. 13 children had vanished that winter, and the locals had bricked up this room with good cause. As Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating symbols carved deep into the walls and a bassinet that looked exactly like the antique one waiting in her nursery upstairs, her blood ran cold. The baby inside her went completely still. But what was that sound coming from the shadows? Was something breathing in there? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's hands trembled as she steadied the flashlight, the beam dancing erratically across the room's contents. The silence from her unborn child was more unsettling than any movement had ever been. She pressed her free hand against her swollen belly, willing the baby to respond, to kick, to do anything that would prove everything was normal. The breathing sound came again, a slow, deliberate inhale followed by a rattling exhale that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. Sarah took a step backward, her heel catching on loose brick debris. The flashlight beam swept upward, revealing the ceiling, and she gasped. Dozens of dried herbs hung in bundles from blackened wooden beams, their brittle leaves rustling despite the absence of any breeze. Lavender, sage, and others she couldn't identify formed a canopy of shadows above her head. Between them, carved directly into the ceiling beams, were more symbols, spirals and crescents, intertwined with what looked like tiny handprints. Children's handprints. "Jesus," she whispered, and immediately regretted speaking aloud. Her voice seemed to be absorbed by the room itself, as if the walls were hungry for sound. The bassinet drew her attention back down. It was ornate, crafted from the same dark wood as the ceiling beams, with intricate carvings along its sides. Sarah knew she should turn around, seal the hole back up, and pretend she'd never found this place. Instead, she found herself moving closer. Each step sent small clouds of dust swirling in the flashlight beam. The floor was wooden, but stained with dark patches that formed an almost deliberate pattern leading toward the bassinet. Sarah followed the stains with growing dread, noting how they seemed to spiral inward like the symbols on the walls. The breathing sound had stopped, but now she could hear something else, a faint whispering that seemed to come from the bassinet itself. Not words exactly, but a rhythmic murmuring that made her skin crawl. When she reached the bassinet, Sarah aimed her flashlight directly into it and immediately wished she hadn't. Nested inside faded silk bedding was a collection of small objects, baby teeth, locks of hair in various shades, tiny shoes that looked handmade, and in the center of it all, a leather-bound journal. Her baby suddenly kicked so hard that Sarah doubled over, gasping. The movement was violent, desperate, as if the child was trying to escape. The flashlight slipped from her grip, clattering to the floor and spinning, sending wild shadows careening around the room. In the strobing light, Sarah caught glimpses of things she'd missed before. Shelves lined with glass jars filled with unidentifiable objects, a rocking chair positioned in the corner, its seat worn smooth by use, and on the far wall, a mirror so old and tarnished that it reflected nothing but darkness. She scrambled to retrieve the flashlight, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward and panic-inducing. As her fingers closed around the metal cylinder, she heard footsteps above her, slow, measured steps crossing the floor of the room directly overhead. But that was impossible. She was alone in the house. Sarah struggled to her feet, pointing the flashlight toward the ceiling as if she could see through it. The footsteps continued back and forth, like someone pacing, or like someone putting a baby to sleep. The whispering from the bassinet grew louder, and now she could make out words. Old words in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were welcoming words, greeting words, words meant for the child she carried. Her baby had gone still again, but this time the silence felt different. Not absent, but listening. Sarah backed toward the hole in the wall, never taking her eyes off the bassinet. She needed to get out, needed to think, needed to understand what she'd stumbled into. But as she reached the opening, the footsteps above stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, she heard one more sound that made her blood freeze, the gentle creaking of a bassinet being rocked back and forth. But she was standing 10 feet away from it. The key turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting all these years for her touch. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as the lock clicked open, the sound echoing through the narrow corridor like a gunshot. She hesitated, her hand trembling on the ornate brass handle, suddenly aware of how alone she was in this sprawling mansion. The baby kicked sharply, making her gasp and place her free hand protectively over her swollen belly. 7 months along, and the little one seemed more restless than usual today, as if sensing her unease. David wouldn't be home from his business trip until Thursday, 3 days away. She could wait for him, let him be the one to open whatever lay behind this door. But curiosity gnawed at her like a physical ache. This was her inheritance, her family's legacy. Grandmother Cordelia had left her everything, despite barely knowing Elena existed before her death. The lawyers had been vague about the details, mentioning only that Elena was the last living heir of the Blackwood line. She pushed the door open. The hinges shrieked in protest, and a wave of stale, musty air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of old wood, dust, and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. The room beyond lay shrouded in darkness, heavy curtains blocking what little afternoon light might have penetrated the grime-covered windows. Elena fumbled for the light switch, her fingers finally finding an old-fashioned brass plate. She flicked it upward, and a single bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the room. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The room was a nursery, but not like any she had ever seen. Antique cribs lined the walls, dozens of them, each one different, spanning what looked like generations of craftsmanship. Some were ornate Victorian pieces with elaborate carvings, others were simpler, more modern designs from the early 20th century. But it wasn't the cribs themselves that made Elena's skin crawl. It was what hung above them. Portraits covered every inch of wall space between the cribs, paintings of women, all bearing a striking resemblance to Elena herself. The same dark hair, the same pale complexion, the same delicate bone structure. But their eyes held a haunting sadness that seemed to follow her as she moved deeper into the room. Each woman was depicted in the final stages of pregnancy, their hands resting protectively over their swollen bellies, their faces a mixture of joy and terror. Brass nameplates beneath each portrait bore names and dates. Constance Blackwood, 1823, Margaret Blackwood, 1856, Victoria Blackwood, 1891, and on, stretching well into the 20th century. Elena's legs felt weak as she sank into an ancient rocking chair positioned in the center of the room. The baby inside her seemed to respond to her distress, moving restlessly, pressing against her ribs. She counted the portraits with growing dread. 23 women, all Blackwoods, all pregnant, all dead. Because as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed the second date on each nameplate. None of the women had lived more than a few months past their pregnancy portraits. Her hands shook as she reached for a leather-bound journal lying open on a small table beside the rocking chair. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with elegant handwriting in faded ink. She recognized the script from old letters she'd found in the mansion's study, her grandmother's writing. The curse continues, read the first line she focused on. Another daughter, born to the Blackwood line, another soul claimed before her time. Margaret lasted only 6 weeks after little Thomas arrived. The labor was difficult, as they all are, as mine was, as mother's was before me. Elena's throat constricted as she read on, her grandmother's words painting a picture of generations of tragedy, difficult births that claimed mother and child alike. Babies born wrong somehow. The journal was frustratingly vague on details, but the implications were terrifying. Women who survived the birth only to waste away from mysterious illnesses, their minds fracturing under the weight of something the journal referred to only as the inheritance. The bloodline must continue. Cordelia had written in an entry dated just months before her death. Elena doesn't know yet, doesn't understand what she carries within her veins. But she will. When her time comes, she'll take her place in this room, and the cycle will begin anew. The family debt must be paid, generation after generation, until the compact is fulfilled. The journal slipped from Elena's nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud. She stared up at the portraits again, seeing them now not as a gallery of ancestors, but as a timeline of doom. Her doom. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Elena felt a sharp pain shoot through her abdomen. Not a contraction. She knew what those felt like from her practice runs. This was something else entirely, something that felt almost purposeful, as if something inside her was awakening. The brass key felt warm against Elena's palm as she climbed the servants' staircase, her flashlight beam dancing across peeling wallpaper and cobwebs that hung like forgotten memories. Each step groaned under her weight, the sound echoing through the narrow passage that wound its way to the mansion's upper reaches. Her pregnancy made the ascent more difficult than it should have been, and she paused frequently to catch her breath, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. The air grew thinner as she climbed, thick with dust and the musty scent of decades-old secrets. When she finally reached the fourth-floor landing, Elena found herself in a cramped corridor she'd never seen before. Unlike the grand hallways below, this space felt utilitarian, designed for servants who were meant to remain invisible. Bare wooden floors stretched ahead of her, and the walls were plain plaster, unmarked by the ornate moldings that decorated the rest of the house. She counted doors as she walked. 1, 2, 3, all standing slightly ajar, revealing empty rooms stripped of furniture long ago. But at the end of the corridor, exactly as the letter had described, stood a door that was different from the others. Heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and sealed with a lock that looked far more substantial than anything else in the house. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached. The door had no number, no nameplate, nothing to indicate what lay beyond. She pressed her ear against the wood and listened, but heard only the sound of her own breathing and the distant settling of the old house. The key trembled in her fingers as she inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting all these years for her touch. The heavy door swung inward with a prolonged creak, and stale air rushed out to meet her, carrying scents that made her stomach lurch. Formaldehyde, decay, and something else, something sweet and cloying that she couldn't identify but that made her skin crawl. Elena stepped across the threshold, sweeping her flashlight beam across the room. What she saw defied her expectations completely. This wasn't a bedroom or storage space. The walls were lined with tall glass cabinets, their contents obscured by decades of dust and grime. A long wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface stained dark with substances she didn't want to contemplate. Shelves lined every available wall space, filled with bottles and jars of various sizes, their labels too faded to read. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, details began to emerge that made her blood run cold. The glass cabinets weren't empty. They contained specimens suspended in murky fluid, their forms twisted and unnatural. Some looked almost human, while others defied classification entirely. Elena forced herself to move closer to one cabinet, wiping away the grime with her sleeve. Inside, floating in yellowed preservative, was what had once been an infant, but something was terribly wrong with it. Extra limbs sprouted from its torso, and its skull was elongated in a way that spoke of deliberate manipulation rather than natural deformity. A brass plate at the base of the cabinet bore an inscription that made Elena's breath catch. Subject 7, Whitmore Bloodline Enhancement, 1923. Her maiden name was Whitmore. With growing horror, she moved to the next cabinet, then the next. Each contained similar specimens, infants and fetuses in various stages of development, all bearing the unmistakable signs of grotesque experimentation. The brass plates told a story that chilled her to the bone. Subject 12, Neural Pathway Modification. Subject 18, Cranial Capacity Expansion. Subject 23, Sensory Enhancement Protocol. At the far end of the room, Elena discovered a desk covered with leather-bound journals. She opened the topmost volume with shaking hands, her flashlight illuminating pages of meticulous notes written in a precise hand. The entries were dated from the 1920s, signed by someone named Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, her great-grandfather. The journal detailed experiments conducted on newborn infants, all bearing the Whitmore name. The doctor's notes spoke of attempts to enhance the family line, to create offspring with supernatural abilities that would ensure the family's dominance for generations to come. He wrote of communing with entities beyond human understanding, of bargains struck in exchange for knowledge that no mortal should possess. Elena's hands flew to her belly as she read further. The experiments had continued for years, each generation of Whitmore children subjected to increasingly horrific procedures. Some survived and were allowed to reproduce, their altered genetics passed down through the bloodline. Others became the specimens that now surrounded her, preserved as testament to their creator's obsession. The final entry in the journal made her knees buckle. The enhancement is hereditary. Each generation carries the potential. The catalyst will manifest when conditions are optimal, when the bloodline is threatened with extinction. Elena was the last of the Whitmore line, and she was carrying what might be the family's final heir. As this realization struck her, she felt movement in her womb. Not the gentle flutter of normal fetal activity, but something urgent and deliberate, as if her unborn child was responding to the presence of its twisted ancestors. The brass key felt unnaturally warm against Elena's palm as she approached the hidden door the next morning. Sleep had eluded her, filled with fragments of dreams where whispered voices called her name from somewhere deep within the walls. Now, standing before the narrow entrance she'd discovered behind the loose panel, every rational thought screamed at her to walk away. But the baby kicked, a gentle flutter that reminded her of why she was here. The inheritance from Great-Aunt Millicent was her only chance at providing a stable home, and she couldn't afford to let superstition override necessity. Still, her hands trembled as she inserted the key. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The air that rushed out was stale and oddly sweet, carrying undertones that made her stomach lurch. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting nausea that had nothing to do with morning sickness. Elena clicked on her flashlight and took her first tentative step. The wooden stairs were solid beneath her feet, though they creaked ominously under her weight. As she descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and she pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The beam of her flashlight revealed stone walls that wept with moisture, and she could hear the faint sound of dripping water echoing from somewhere ahead. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a circular chamber carved directly from the bedrock beneath the mansion. The space was larger than she'd expected, perhaps 20 feet across, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above, but it was what occupied the center of the room that made her blood run cold. A stone altar dominated the space, its surface stained dark with what could only be old blood. Symbols were carved around its edges, not letters or words she recognized, but twisting, organic shapes that seemed to writhe in the shifting flashlight beam. Surrounding the altar in a perfect circle were 7 wooden cribs, each one draped in rotting lace that might once have been white. Elena's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she forced herself to step closer. The cribs were antiques, their wood dark with age and carved with the same strange symbols that adorned the altar. But it was what lay within them that sent ice through her veins. Each crib contained the desiccated remains of an infant, their tiny bodies wrapped in christening gowns that had yellowed to the color of old bones. Some bore small brass nameplate that had tarnished black with time. With mounting horror, she leaned over the nearest crib and squinted at the engraving. Millicent Blackthorne, born 1892, offered 1892. Her great-aunt's name. But that was impossible. Millicent had lived to be 97, had been the one to leave Elena this house. Unless... Elena stumbled to the next crib. Margaret Blackthorne, born 1863, offered 1863. Then another, Catherine Blackthorne, born 1834, offered 1834. Each nameplate told the same horrifying story. Blackthorne women, born and offered in the same year, spanning back generations. But the final crib was empty, its brass nameplate gleaming new against the ancient wood. Elena's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the flashlight as she read the inscription. Elena Blackthorne expected 2024 to be offered 2024. A sob escaped her throat as the full implications crashed over her. The inheritance wasn't a gift, it was a trap. The Blackthorne family had been feeding their female children to whatever dark power dwelt in this chamber for over a century. And now it was her turn. She spun around, desperate to flee, but stopped short when her light fell upon the walls. They were covered in journals, hundreds of leather-bound volumes arranged on stone shelves. Despite every instinct telling her to run, Elena found herself drawn to them. She pulled down the nearest journal and opened it to a random page. The handwriting was spidery but legible. The compact must be maintained. Each generation must offer the firstborn daughter to ensure the family's prosperity. The old ones demand their due, and in return they grant us wealth beyond measure. Today I offered my precious Catherine to the shadow that dwells beneath. Her sacrifice will feed our bloodline's power for another generation. Elena's knees buckled, and she gripped the altar for support, immediately recoiling from its cold, blood-stained surface. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if sensing the danger. She pressed both hands to her belly, a fierce protectiveness overwhelming her fear. "Not my child," she whispered into the oppressive darkness. "I'll die before I let you have my baby." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel something stirring in the shadows beyond her flashlight's reach. The temperature plummeted further, and her breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Whatever had been sleeping in this place for decades was beginning to wake, drawn by her presence and the promise of fresh sacrifice. Elena ran for the stairs, her footsteps echoing behind her like gunshots in the stone chamber. The brass key felt unnaturally warm against Elena's palm as she stood before the sealed door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The narrow beam of her flashlight illuminated the ornate keyhole, its edges green with age. Behind her, the mansion's silence pressed down like a living thing, broken only by the distant creaking of settling wood and her own ragged breathing. She inserted the key with trembling fingers. It turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been waiting for this moment. The heavy door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, releasing a rush of stale air that carried the scent of old roses and something else, something metallic and sweet that made her stomach lurch. The flashlight beams swept across the hidden room, revealing walls lined with dark wood paneling and shelves filled with leather-bound journals. At the center of the space stood an antique writing desk, its surface covered with yellowed papers and strange instruments she couldn't identify. But it was the far wall that made her breath catch in her throat. Portraits, dozens of them, arranged in careful rows from floor to ceiling. All women, all bearing the distinctive Blackwood features, the sharp cheekbones, the deep-set eyes, the auburn hair. But there was something wrong with their faces, something that made Elena's skin crawl. Their eyes seemed to follow her movement, and their smiles held secrets that chilled her to the bone. As she stepped deeper into the room, her flashlight illuminated brass nameplates beneath each portrait. Constance Blackwood, 1823 to 1824. Margaret Blackwood, 1851 to 1852. Victoria Blackwood, 1889 to 1890. The pattern was unmistakable. Each woman had lived for barely a year after the date their portraits were painted. The baby stirred restlessly in her womb, and Elena pressed her free hand to her belly, trying to calm the sudden urgency in its movements. The child had been unusually active since she'd entered the mansion, as if responding to something she couldn't perceive. On the desk, the yellowed papers proved to be pages torn from journals, covered in spidery handwriting. Elena picked up the topmost sheet and read by flashlight, squinting at the faded ink. "The ritual must continue," the entry began. "Each generation, one must be chosen to carry forward the legacy. The child will serve as vessel, as I once did, as my grandmother before me. The bloodline must not be broken, lest the family fall to ruin and shadow." Elena's hands shook as she read on. The journal entry described a ceremony, something about preparing the vessel and ensuring the transfer. The words swam before her eyes as their meaning sank in. These women, her ancestors, hadn't died of natural causes. They'd been sacrificed, and their children. She grabbed another page, this one in different handwriting. "The baby is due soon. Mother says the transition will be swift, that I won't suffer as the others did. But I've seen the truth in the cellar. I know what becomes of the mothers once the children are born. I know what lives inside those innocent faces." A floorboard creaked behind her. Elena spun around, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The portraits seemed to have shifted slightly, their painted eyes now focused entirely on her. But the doorway remained empty. "Just old wood," she whispered to herself, but her voice came out as barely a croak. She turned back to the desk and noticed a leather-bound book she'd missed before, its cover embossed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The pages fell open to reveal detailed anatomical drawings of pregnant women, their bellies cut away to show the developing children within. But these weren't medical illustrations. They were ritualistic diagrams showing the proper way to harvest the vessel and preserve the essence. The baby kicked hard enough to make Elena gasp and double over. When she straightened, she found herself staring directly at the largest portrait on the wall, a woman who looked exactly like her, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow. The nameplate read, "Evangeline Blackwood, 1923 to 1924. But that was impossible. Elena had never heard of any Evangeline in the family history her grandmother had shared. And yet, the resemblance was undeniable. Her flashlight beam caught something else, a final journal entry pinned beneath the strange instruments on the desk. The handwriting was fresh, the ink still black. Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the careful script. It was her grandmother's handwriting. "Elena will come to the house when she is with child, just as I arranged. The bloodline has grown weak over the generations, too much intermarrying with outsiders, too much dilution of the pure essence. But she carries twins, and twins will restore our power. The ceremony can finally be completed as it was meant to be, with 2 vessels instead of 1. The flashlight slipped from Elena's numb fingers and clattered to the floor, its beams spinning wildly before going dark. In the sudden blackness, she could swear she heard the portraits whispering her name, and deep in her belly, both babies began to move with increasing violence, as if they were trying to claw their way out. The brass key felt ice-cold against Elena's palm as she stood before the sealed door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her anxiety. Behind her, Marcus held the flashlight steady, casting dancing shadows across the basement's stone walls. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, though his voice seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. Elena nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her. The photographs scattered across Grandmother Vivian's desk had shown this door, always in the background, sometimes with figures standing before it. In one particularly disturbing image from 1923, she'd seen what looked like a woman in a white dress being led toward the entrance by several men in dark suits. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease. Elena turned it slowly, feeling ancient mechanisms grinding to life within the door's framework. A soft click echoed through the basement, followed by a sound like escaping air, or perhaps a held breath finally released. The heavy door swung inward on silent hinges. The smell hit them first. Not decay, as Elena had expected, but something far more unsettling. A sweet, cloying scent like overripe fruit mixed with old flowers. The flashlight beam pierced the darkness beyond, revealing a room that seemed to exist outside of time. The space was larger than the basement itself should have allowed, stretching back into shadows that the light couldn't penetrate. The walls were lined with shelves upon shelves of glass jars, each one filled with a murky liquid that seemed to move and swirl of its own accord. Between the shelves hung portraits in ornate frames, dozens of women, all bearing the unmistakable features of the Blackwood bloodline. But these weren't normal portraits. The women's eyes seemed to track their movement, and their mouths were open in silent screams. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, grabbing Elena's arm. "We need to leave, now." But Elena was transfixed by what lay in the center of the room. A circular stone platform held an ornate cradle carved from black wood. Around its base, symbols had been etched into the stone. The same symbols she'd been finding throughout the house, but here they formed an intricate pattern that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. As they moved deeper into the room, the flashlight beam swept across a table laden with leather-bound journals and strange instruments that looked more suited to a medieval torture chamber than any legitimate purpose. Elena approached the nearest journal, its cover marked with the Blackwood family crest. The pages fell open to reveal her great-great-grandmother's spidery handwriting. The 7th generation nears completion. Catherine's child will be the vessel, as was foretold. The binding grows weak with each passing year, but soon we shall have what we need to renew it. Elena's blood turned to ice. Catherine, that was her grandmother's name before she'd married. She flipped through more pages, her hands trembling. Entry after entry detailed a horrifying truth. For over a century, the Blackwood women had been offering their children to something that lived in the darkness beyond the sealed room. Not all their children, just enough to maintain what the journal called the covenant. The entity feeds on innocence. Read one passage. It sustains our family's prosperity and protects us from the ravages of time, but the price must be paid with each new generation. The child must be pure, unmarked by the world, their soul fresh and malleable. Marcus was backing toward the door. "Elena, we're leaving, right now." But she couldn't stop reading. The journal spoke of other children who had been brought to this room, children who had entered but never left. Their essence was supposedly preserved in the glass jars lining the walls, feeding whatever dark presence the family had been serving for generations. A soft sound from the shadows beyond the platform made them both freeze. It was barely audible, like fabric rustling, or perhaps something breathing that shouldn't have been breathing at all. The baby in Elena's womb suddenly went still, completely, unnaturally still. "No," she whispered, pressing her hands to her belly. "No, no, no." The rustling sound grew closer, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The liquid in the nearest jars began to bubble and churn, and Elena could swear she saw tiny faces pressing against the glass from within. That's when she noticed the newest journal, still open on the table. The ink was fresh, the handwriting familiar. Her grandmother's final entry, dated just 3 days before her death. "Elena carries the promised child. She will come to understand her purpose when the time is right." The sealing of the room was only temporary, a test of her determination. When she opens it again, the covenant will be renewed, and the family will endure another century. She has no choice. None of us ever did. The baby kicked once, hard, and Elena felt something else respond, something hungry and ancient stirring in the darkness beyond the platform, finally awakening after decades of patient waiting. The leather-bound journal trembled in Margaret's hands as she carried it from the sealed room, her flashlight beam dancing erratically across the mansion's darkened hallway. Each step seemed to echo with unnatural resonance, as if the house itself was listening. The baby kicked restlessly against her ribs, and she pressed her free hand to her swollen belly, whispering reassurances that felt hollow even to her own ears. Back in the relative safety of the library, Margaret settled into the worn velvet armchair by the window, where afternoon light could chase away the shadows that seemed to cling to her skin. The journal's cover was unmarked except for a strange symbol burned into the leather, 3 interlocking circles surrounding what looked like a tree with roots that spiraled downward into darkness. She opened to the first page, and her breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakably familiar, identical to her own flowing script. At the top of the page, in faded brown ink that looked disturbingly like dried blood, was written, "The Chronicle of Eleanor Blackthorne, Year of Our Lord, 1923. Eleanor, Margaret's great-grandmother, the woman whose portrait hung in the main hall with those haunting green eyes that mirrored her own, the woman who had supposedly died in childbirth, along with her baby. Margaret's hands shook as she read the first entry. The dreams have begun again. Each night I see the tree in the garden growing larger, its roots stretching beneath the house like grasping fingers. Mother says it is merely the condition affecting my mind, but I know better. The child within me stirs not with life, but with something else entirely, something hungry." The baby kicked hard, and Margaret gasped, nearly dropping the journal. She looked down at her belly, watching the strange rolling movements beneath her skin. For a moment it almost looked like something was pressing outward, leaving the impression of tiny hands against the fabric of her dress. She forced herself to continue reading. "Father has sealed the room where it happened, where great-grandmother performed the ritual that bound our bloodline to them. He thinks he can stop what was set in motion generations ago, but the pact cannot be broken so easily. The tree remembers, the roots remember, and now my child will remember too." Margaret's blood ran cold. The sealed room, she had found it, opened it. The table, the symbols, the photographs of pregnant women spanning decades, all of them with the same green eyes, the same desperate expression she had seen in her own mirror lately. "I have discovered the truth about our family's prosperity. Each generation one must be chosen to carry their seed. Not human seed, but something far older, something that hungers for the warmth of the living world. The women in the photographs, my grandmother, her grandmother before her, they all bore the burden gladly, believing they were ensuring the family's continued wealth and status." Margaret's vision blurred as panic set in. The baby's movements became more violent, and she could swear she felt something sharp pressing against her from within. She pressed on, desperate to understand. "But I have learned what truly happens to the children. They are not born to live among us. They are born to feed, to grow strong enough to cross the veil between worlds. The tree in the garden is not a tree at all. It is a doorway, and its roots run deep into realms where things that should not be wait patiently for their turn to taste our reality." Outside, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, turning the afternoon dark as twilight. The mansion creaked and groaned around her, and Margaret could hear something moving in the walls, a scratching, scuttling sound that seemed to follow her breathing. "I will not let them take my child. Tonight, I go to the tree. I will try to sever the connection, to break the bond that has cursed our bloodline for over a century. If I fail, if this journal is found after my death, let whoever reads these words know this. The child I carry is not meant for this world, and neither are any that come after. The pact demands payment, but perhaps there is another way." The final entry was smeared and barely legible, the handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. "The roots, they're inside me now. I can feel them growing, spreading. The baby, oh God, the baby is helping them. It wants to be born, wants to open the door wide. But I won't let it. I'd rather die than unleash that thing upon the world. The room must stay sealed. The tree must never fruit again. Tell my husband, tell him to burn it all down if he loves me. Burn it all." The journal ended there, but tucked between the last pages, Margaret found a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, she opened it to reveal a crude map of the mansion's grounds, with a large X marked over the ancient oak tree in the garden, the same tree whose roots had cracked the foundation, the same tree she had admired for its otherworldly beauty. As thunder rolled overhead, Margaret felt something shift inside her, and for the first time, she wondered if the movements she felt were her baby trying to get out, or something else trying to get in. The floorboards groaned under Sarah's weight as she descended into the hidden chamber, each step echoing through the suffocating darkness. The beam from her flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing walls lined with ancient bookshelves and glass cabinets that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. The air hung thick with the scent of old parchment and something else, something metallic that made her stomach turn. Her hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly as the baby kicked, a sharp reminder of why she couldn't turn back now. Whatever secrets this room held about the Blackwood family, she needed to know. The nightmares, the whispers in the walls, the feeling that something was growing stronger inside her with each passing day, it all led here. The first thing that caught her attention was a massive oak desk positioned in the center of the room, its surface covered with yellowed documents and leather-bound journals. As she approached, her flashlight illuminated a brass nameplate, Dr. Ezekiel Blackwood, 1847 to 1923. Her great-great-grandfather, the family patriarch she'd heard whispered about, but never understood why. Sarah opened the topmost journal, its binding cracking with age. The handwriting was precise, clinical, but the words made her blood freeze. The 13th generation approaches completion. Margaret carries the vessel as foretold, though she remains ignorant of her true purpose. The bloodline has been carefully cultivated for this moment, each birth, each death, each union orchestrated to achieve purity of essence. Soon the keeper will have a suitable form to inhabit. Her hands trembled as she turned the page, revealing detailed anatomical drawings of pregnant women in various stages of development. But these weren't normal medical illustrations. Strange symbols were carved into the bellies, and dark tentacle-like appendages seemed to emerge from within the wombs. The previous attempts have failed due to insufficient spiritual preparation. The mothers must remain unaware until the final trimester, when the soul is most malleable. Fear and desperation strengthen the connection. Elizabeth showed promise until she discovered the truth too early. Her resistance nearly destroyed everything. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Elizabeth, her grandmother's name. The woman who had supposedly died in childbirth along with her baby, but according to these notes, something far more sinister had occurred. She flipped through more pages, finding birth records dating back generations. Every woman in her family line was documented here, their pregnancies tracked with obsessive detail. Symbols and markings indicated successes and failures, with notes about spiritual readiness and vessel compatibility. A glass cabinet against the far wall drew her attention. Inside, preserved in murky fluid, were specimens that defied explanation. What looked like human fetuses, but wrong somehow. Too many limbs, eyes where there shouldn't be eyes, and always those same dark appendages she'd seen in the drawings. "My God," she whispered, backing away from the cabinet. The baby inside her kicked again, more violently this time, as if responding to her discovery. Behind the specimens, she found a larger jar that made her legs give out. Floating inside was something that had once been human, but had been transformed into something else entirely. The placard beneath read, "Elizabeth Blackwood, partial manifestation, 1962. Sarah collapsed into a chair, her mind reeling. Her grandmother hadn't died in childbirth. She had become something else, something that was neither human nor entirely other, and if the pattern held true, if this 13th generation referred to her own pregnancy. She forced herself to keep reading, searching for any mention of escape or prevention. The journals revealed a family history stretching back to the 1800s, when Ezekiel Blackwood had first made contact with something he called the Keeper, an entity that existed between worlds, seeking a permanent anchor in reality. Each generation brings us closer to perfection. The bloodline grows stronger, more receptive. The children born to the failed attempts still carry the mark, passing it down unknowingly. But the 13th will be different. The stars align, and the barriers grow thin. Soon, the Keeper will walk among us, clothed in flesh of our own making. The final entry was dated just months before Ezekiel's supposed death. I have prepared the room. The seals are in place, the rituals complete. Should I not survive to see the culmination, the house itself will guide the final vessel when the time comes. The whispers will call her, the dreams will show her way. She will come willingly, driven by love for her unborn child, never knowing that love will be her undoing. Sarah slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. The baby's movements had become frantic now, as if it too sensed the danger they were in. She struggled to her feet, desperate to leave this cursed room, but as she turned toward the stairs, her flashlight beam caught something that made her blood turn to ice. There, carved deep into the wall behind the desk, was a countdown. 13 tally marks, with 12 already crossed out. Only one remained unmarked, and beneath it, scratched in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "Welcome home, Sarah." The brass key felt ice-cold against Sarah's palm as she descended the mansion's main staircase, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet runner. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 3 times, its hollow notes echoing through the darkness. She'd waited until Marcus fell into his deepest sleep, the kind that came after his 3rd glass of whiskey and another heated argument about selling the house. The hidden door behind the library's false wall stood exactly as she'd left it 12 hours ago, waiting like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Sarah pressed her hand against her swollen belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. Even in sleep, her child seemed to sense something wrong about this place. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the life growing inside her, "but I have to know." The key slid into the ancient lock with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The mechanism turned with a soft click that seemed to reverberate through Sarah's bones. She pushed the door open and was immediately assaulted by a wave of stale air that tasted of copper and something else, something sweet and putrid that made her gag. The beam of her flashlight cut through absolute darkness, revealing stone steps that descended far deeper than she'd anticipated. The walls were carved from the same granite as the mansion's foundation, but these stones bore markings, symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they shifted and writhed in her peripheral vision. Each step down felt like a descent into another world. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Sarah pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, a sharp reminder of how foolish this midnight exploration might be. But the compulsion to continue felt stronger than fear, as if invisible hands were guiding her forward. The staircase ended at a circular chamber that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The space was larger than she'd expected, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadow above, but it was what filled the room that made her legs nearly buckle. Dozens of glass vessels lined the curved walls, each one roughly the size of a human torso. Inside the murky liquid that filled them, shapes floated, shapes that looked disturbingly like. Sarah stumbled closer to the nearest vessel, her flashlight beam trembling. The thing inside was definitely organic, definitely human in its basic structure, but wrong in ways that made her mind recoil. It had too many limbs, fingers that ended in points too sharp to be natural, and where its face should have been, there was only smooth skin stretched tight over what might have been features. A brass nameplate at the base of the vessel bore an inscription in elegant script, "Evelyn Blackwood, born October 13th, 1847. 6th iteration. Sarah moved to the next vessel, then the next. Each contained a similar malformed figure, each bearing a nameplate with dates spanning over a century. The names were all familiar, Blackwoods generation after generation, but the birth years were impossible. No one could live that long. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal supporting a leather-bound journal. Sarah approached it with mounting dread, knowing she was about to learn something that would shatter whatever remained of her normal world. The journal fell open to a page covered in her great-grandmother's spidery handwriting. "The bloodline must be preserved," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "The old ones demand their vessel, and we who carry their blessing must ensure continuity. Each birth brings us closer to perfection, each generation a step toward the promised transformation." The next page contained detailed anatomical drawings that made Sarah's stomach lurch. Diagrams showing the progression of changes through what appeared to be multiple lifespans, bodies that grew and twisted and adapted over decades. Notes in the margins described regeneration cycles and consciousness transfers in clinical detail. "The child must be prepared from conception," another passage read. "The ritual binding ensures that the soul remains tethered even as the flesh transforms. What appears to be death is merely transition to the next phase of existence." Sarah's hands shook as she turned more pages, finding photographs that documented the horrifying reality behind the journal's clinical language. Images of her ancestors at different stages of their unnatural lives, showing how they changed, how they became something other than human, while retaining just enough of their original appearance to pass undetected in the world above. The final entry was dated just 2 months before her great-grandmother's supposed death. "Sarah carries the next vessel. The signs are strong in this one. The child will be the culmination of our work, the perfect synthesis of human and divine. I have prepared the binding ritual. When the time comes, she will understand her true purpose." A sound from behind made Sarah spin around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Marcus stood at the bottom of the stairs, but his expression was unlike any she'd ever seen on his face, ancient, knowing, and completely devoid of the warmth she'd fallen in love with. "Hello, darling," he said, his voice carrying undertones that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "I was wondering when you'd finally find your way down here." The basement felt different now, as if the very air had thickened with malevolent intent. Sarah descended the creaking stairs, her flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to writhe and retreat from the beam. The sealed room's door stood ajar, just as she'd left it hours earlier, but something had changed. The smell that wafted up from below was no longer just musty decay. It carried notes of copper and something sickeningly sweet. Her baby kicked restlessly, and Sarah pressed her free hand against her swollen belly. The movements felt urgent, almost frantic, as if the child sensed the wrongness permeating the house. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, pack her bags, and never look back, but the journal entries she'd found had revealed too much to ignore. The Blackwood family curse wasn't just superstition. It was a deliberate pact, renewed every generation through an unspeakable ritual. And according to her great-grandmother's careful records, Sarah was already 3 days past the deadline. Inside the sealed room, the ancient symbols carved into the stone walls seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision. When she looked directly at them, they appeared static, but the moment she turned away, they writhed like living things. The altar at the room's center was stained dark with what she now knew wasn't rust. Fresh drops of something wet gleamed on its surface. Sarah approached the altar with trembling steps. Behind it, partially hidden in an alcove she hadn't noticed before, stood a collection of glass containers. Each one bore a brass nameplate: Margaret Blackwood, 1892, Elizabeth Blackwood, 1919, Catherine Blackwood, 1943, Victoria Blackwood, 1971. Her breath caught as she read the final plate: Elena Blackwood, 1998, her mother. The container that bore Elena's name was larger than the others, its contents floating in a viscous amber fluid. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed what looked like umbilical cord, placental tissue, and something else, something that made her stomach lurch. Tiny, perfectly formed fingers. The preserved remains of what would have been Sarah's sibling, the child her mother claimed to have miscarried. But according to the journal, there had been no miscarriage. There had been a choice. The ritual required a sacrifice from each generation of Blackwood women, the firstborn child offered to maintain the family's prosperity and to keep something else at bay, something that had been trapped in this room for over a century, growing stronger with each feeding. Sarah's mother had broken the pact. She'd refused to complete the ritual, choosing instead to flee with infant Sarah. The consequences had been swift and merciless. Elena Blackwood's death in that car accident hadn't been random, it had been retribution. Now the debt had passed to Sarah, compounded by 30 years of interest. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the basement, a wet sliding noise like something large dragging itself across stone. Sarah spun toward the doorway, her flashlight beam dancing wildly. The house was settling, she told herself. Old pipes, anything but what her racing mind was suggesting. But she'd read the oldest journal entries, the ones written in her ancestor's shaking hand. She knew what lived beneath the Blackwood mansion, what had been bound here by blood and sustained by generations of sacrifice. The thing that her family had fed for over 100 years was not content to wait any longer. Another sound, closer now, a rhythmic tapping like claws against stone or fingernails. Sarah backed away from the altar, but her foot caught on an uneven stone. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall, her hand pressing against one of the carved symbols. The moment her skin made contact, the symbol flared with sickly yellow light, and agony shot up her arm. The baby convulsed inside her, and Sarah screamed. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, not physical but something deeper. She could feel something reaching into her womb, seeking, testing, claiming. Through her terror, she understood. The ritual didn't require her to sacrifice the child after birth. It required her to mark the baby while it was still inside her, to brand her bloodline with the family's curse. The touch of the symbol had begun the process. Sarah tore her hand away from the wall, but the damage was done. She could feel something foreign moving through her body, seeking her child. On her palm, the symbol's pattern was burned into her flesh, glowing faintly in the darkness. The tapping sounds grew louder, accompanied now by a low, hungry breathing that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Whatever her ancestors had bound here was awakening, drawn by the scent of fresh blood and the promise of another generation's servitude. Sarah ran for the stairs, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she fled. Behind her, something large and wet emerged from the deeper shadows of the sealed room, following the scent of marked prey. The hunt had begun, and Sarah finally understood why her mother had been so desperate to escape. The Blackwood curse would not be denied again. The basement felt different now, as if the very air had thickened with ancient malevolence. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the stone steps that led deeper into the earth than she'd ever ventured. Each footfall echoed with a hollow sound that seemed to mock her determination. Behind the collapsed wall lay another chamber, this one carved directly from bedrock. The air here was stale, untouched by circulation for decades. Her light swept across walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when observed peripherally, forcing her eyes to water and her head to pound. In the center of the room stood an ornate wooden table, its surface stained dark with substances she didn't want to identify. Leather-bound journals lay scattered across it, their pages yellowed and brittle. Sarah approached cautiously, one hand instinctively protecting her swollen belly as the baby stirred restlessly within. The first journal bore the name Ezekiel Blackwood in faded gold lettering. Her great-great-grandfather's precise handwriting filled page after page with entries that made her stomach churn. She read of rituals performed in this very room, of bargains struck with entities that existed beyond human understanding. The dates went back over a century, but the implications reached forward to touch her present moment. The bloodline must be preserved, one entry read. Each generation, a vessel must be prepared. The child born of shadow and flesh shall carry forward our covenant. What was promised must be delivered. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages, finding detailed anatomical drawings of pregnant women, their bodies marked with the same symbols that adorned these walls. Notes in the margins described procedures that seemed part medical, part occult ritual. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if trying to escape what it somehow sensed approaching. Another journal, this one belonging to her great-grandmother Margaret, revealed the true horror of the family's legacy. Margaret had tried to break the cycle, had attempted to flee with her unborn child. The entries chronicled her growing desperation as supernatural forces pulled her back, as the entity they'd awakened demanded its due. "It speaks to me in dreams," Margaret had written in increasingly erratic handwriting. "Tells me the child belongs to it, that our family promised long ago to provide vessels for its return. I feel it growing stronger as the baby grows larger. God help me. I fear what will emerge when my time comes." The final entries were barely legible, scrawled in what looked suspiciously like blood. Margaret described feeling the presence moving within her womb alongside her child, feeding off the developing life, preparing to inhabit the newborn flesh. The last entry was a single word repeated dozens of times: consumed. Sarah dropped the journal with shaking hands, backing away from the table. But her retreat was halted by something that made her blood freeze. A small wooden crib, ancient and weathered, sitting in the far corner of the chamber. Inside lay the remnants of infant clothing, tiny garments that crumbled at her touch. Above the crib, carved into the stone wall, was an inscription that made her knees weak. "Here lies the first offering, taken in 1847. Here shall lie the last, when the circle closes and the debt is paid." The baby's movements became violent now, painful kicks and rolls that felt almost panicked. Sarah gasped, pressing both hands to her belly as she realized the horrible truth. Every woman in her family line had been brought to this room, had learned of this covenant too late to escape it. The entity that Ezekiel had bargained with demanded payment in the form of newborn souls, using each generation's children as vessels for its return to the physical world. A sound from above made her freeze, footsteps crossing the main floor, deliberate and measured. Someone else was in the house. Sarah clicked off her flashlight, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. The footsteps paused directly overhead, as if the intruder knew exactly where she was hiding. Then came a voice, calling down through the floorboards with sickeningly familiar tones. Her husband's voice, but wrong somehow, carrying inflections that belonged to another time, another presence entirely. "Sarah, my dear descendant, it's time to come upstairs. The preparations must begin before the moon reaches its zenith. Our ancient compact requires fulfillment, and your child has been chosen as the final vessel." The voice continued, but the words were no longer in English. They were in the same incomprehensible language she'd found scattered throughout the journals, syllables that seemed to bypass her ears and etch themselves directly onto her consciousness. As the alien phrases echoed through the darkness, she felt something respond within her womb, a presence that was decidedly not her unborn child. Sarah pressed her back against the cold stone wall, one hand clutching the flashlight, the other protecting her belly. Whatever had taken possession of her husband's voice was calling to something that was already inside her, something that had been waiting patiently for over 7 months to finally claim what it had been promised more than a century ago. The candle flame danced wildly as Elena descended into what she could only describe as hell itself. The wooden steps, slick with decades of moisture and something far worse, groaned under her weight. Each footfall echoed in the cavernous space below, returning to her ears distorted and multiplied, as if the darkness itself was mocking her presence. The stench hit her like a physical blow. Decay, yes, but underneath it something sweet and cloying that made her stomach lurch. She pressed her free hand against her mouth, fighting the urge to vomit, and forced herself to continue down into the bowels of Blackmore House. The basement stretched far beyond what should have been possible given the mansion's footprint. Stone walls glistened with an oily film that seemed to pulse in the candlelight, and Elena realized with growing horror that the substance wasn't water seepage at all. It was moving, flowing in deliberate patterns that resembled veins or arteries feeding some unseen heart. Along the walls, arranged in neat rows like a grotesque library, stood dozens of glass vessels, each one roughly the size of a human torso, filled with a murky amber fluid that swirled with its own internal current. Elena approached the nearest one, her breath coming in short, painful gasps, and peered inside. A face stared back at her. Not quite human, but close enough to send ice through her veins. The features were elongated, the skull stretched upward to accommodate what appeared to be extra folds of brain matter visible through translucent skin. The eyes, though closed, were too large, and when Elena shifted the candle, she caught a glimpse of additional eye sockets along the temples. The thing in the jar was breathing. Elena stumbled backward, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. The baby kicked violently, as if sensing her terror, and for a moment she felt something else, a presence that wasn't her own, pressing against her consciousness from within. Beautiful, aren't they? Elena spun around, nearly dropping the candle. Margaret stood at the bottom of the stairs, but not as Elena had ever seen her before. The elderly woman's skin had taken on the same translucent quality as the creatures in the jars, and her eyes, dear God, her eyes, were completely black, as if filled with the same dark fluid that had poured from the portrait upstairs. "You shouldn't have come down here yet," Margaret continued, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Elena's bones. "The birth is still weeks away, but I suppose the blood calls to the blood, doesn't it?" "What are those things?" Elena managed to whisper. Margaret smiled, revealing teeth that had grown too long, too sharp. "Family," she said simply. "Generations of Blackmores who accepted their true heritage, who embraced what we really are." She gestured to the jars with something approaching maternal pride. "Your great-grandmother, Catherine, your great-great-uncle, Silas, all of them preserved in their perfect state, waiting for the awakening." "Awakening?" Elena's voice cracked. "When the bloodline is complete, when the vessel is pure enough to carry our true ancestor into this world." Margaret's gaze dropped to Elena's belly, and her smile widened impossibly. "Your child, dear one, the culmination of a century of careful breeding, of preparation, the one who will finally allow our patriarch to return." The baby kicked again, and this time Elena felt it, a foreign intelligence touching hers, alien and ancient and hungry. She gasped, doubling over as visions flooded her mind, the mansion as it had been over 100 years ago, filled with robed figures conducting unspeakable rituals, a massive creature with too many limbs and eyes like black stars, speaking promises of power in exchange for service, generations of Blackmore women, each carrying children that were something more and less than human. "The sealed room was never meant to keep something out," Margaret explained, moving closer with that unnaturally fluid gait. "It was meant to keep our preparations safe until the time was right. Every woman who lived in this house, every child born within these walls has been part of the grand design." Elena tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The presence in her womb was growing stronger, pressing against her will, and she realized with dawning horror that her pregnancy had never been natural at all. The timing, the sudden inheritance, even meeting David, all of it orchestrated by whatever lived beneath Blackmore House. "Don't fight it," Margaret whispered, now close enough that Elena could smell the preservation fluid on her breath. "Your body was bred for this purpose. Your child will be magnificent, part human, part something far greater, and when the birth comes, when the barrier between worlds grows thin enough, our master will finally walk the earth again." The candle guttered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the blackness, Elena heard the sound of glass breaking, of fluid spilling across stone, and the wet, eager sounds of things that should not exist beginning to stir. From somewhere in the darkness, Margaret's laughter echoed like a hymn to madness. The candles flickered as Margaret descended the spiral staircase, their warm light casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Each step echoed in the narrow passage, a hollow sound that seemed to mock her determination. The air grew thicker as she went deeper, carrying with it the metallic taste of old blood and something else, something that made her unborn child shift restlessly within her womb. At the bottom, she found herself in a circular chamber carved from living rock. The walls were covered in the same symbols she'd seen upstairs, but here they seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. In the center of the room stood an altar made of black stone, its surface stained with dark patches that gleamed wet despite the obvious age of whatever had spilled there. Behind the altar, barely visible in the candlelight, hung a massive painting. As Margaret approached, her breath caught in her throat. The canvas depicted a family portrait spanning generations, dozens of faces arranged in an impossible composition that seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't looking directly at it. But it was the expressions that made her stomach lurch. Every face bore the same look of desperate hunger, and every pair of eyes seemed to follow her movement through the chamber. She recognized some of the faces from the portraits upstairs, but here they looked different, predatory. Their mouths were slightly open, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. At the bottom of the painting, in elegant script that seemed to have been written in something darker than ink, were the words, "The Covenant of Sustenance." Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her belly as the baby kicked violently, as if trying to escape what it sensed in this place. She noticed that her family's distinctive birthmark, the crescent moon shape she'd always thought was merely genetic, appeared on every figure in the painting. But here, it seemed to glow with an inner light, pulsing in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. A sound from behind made her turn. Dr. Hale stood at the bottom of the stairs, no longer maintaining his facade of concern. His face had taken on the same predatory expression she'd seen in the painting, and when he smiled, his teeth gleamed sharp in the candlelight. "I was hoping you'd find this place eventually," he said, stepping into the chamber, "though I must admit you're cutting it rather close to the deadline." "What deadline?" Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The winter solstice, my dear. The longest night, when the veil is thinnest, when the transfer can be completed." He gestured to the altar. "Your family has maintained this tradition for over 2 centuries. Every generation, one child is chosen, one vessel prepared." Margaret backed away from him, her free hand still clutching the candle. "You're insane. I don't know what you think my family was involved in, but nothing." His voice cut through her protests like a blade. "Did you really think it was coincidence that brought you here? That made you inherit this house precisely when you were carrying new life?" He laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the stone chamber. "We've been watching your bloodline, guiding it, ensuring the purity remained intact. You are the culmination of generations of careful breeding." The baby moved again, more frantically now, and Margaret felt something else, a presence pressing against her consciousness, trying to push its way in. The birthmark on her shoulder began to burn with an intensity that made her gasp. "The child you carry isn't entirely human," Dr. Hale continued, moving closer. "Your ancestor made a bargain in this very room, eternal life for the family line in exchange for providing vessels for those who came before. The dead need the living to continue, and the young provide the strongest vessels." Margaret's mind reeled as pieces began falling into place. Her mother's sudden death, the lawyer who'd insisted she take immediate possession of the house, Dr. Hale's mysterious availability and willingness to make house calls. Even her pregnancy itself. She remembered now how strange it had been, how quickly it had happened after moving into the house. "The previous occupants," she managed to say. "They're still here, aren't they?" "Waiting," he confirmed, "growing stronger as the solstice approaches. And your child will provide the perfect vessel for the most ancient among them. Your great-great-grandmother Vivian has been particularly eager for rebirth." As if summoned by her name, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candle flame guttered and nearly died, and in that moment of near darkness, Margaret saw them. Translucent figures emerging from the walls, their eyes burning with the same hunger she'd seen in the painting. They moved toward her with deliberate slowness, savoring her terror. The baby's movements became so violent that Margaret doubled over in pain. She could feel something foreign pressing against her thoughts, trying to establish a connection with the life inside her. The birthmark felt like it was on fire, and she realized with growing horror that it wasn't just a mark, it was a sigil, a beacon calling to the restless dead. "Don't fight it," Dr. Hale whispered. "Your family has served this purpose for generations. Your child will know immortality." The photograph trembled in Elena's hands as she stared at the face that could have been her own reflection. The woman in the sepia-toned image wore the same high cheekbones, the same determined set to her jaw, the same dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets. But what made Elena's blood run cold was the swollen belly beneath the woman's Victorian dress, and the look of absolute terror etched across her features. Behind the photograph, more images spilled from the hidden compartment she'd discovered in the sealed room's writing desk. Each one showed a different pregnant woman, spanning decades, maybe centuries. All bore the unmistakable family resemblance. All looked terrified. The baby kicked hard against Elena's ribs, as if sensing her distress. She pressed a protective hand to her belly and forced herself to examine the photographs more carefully. On the back of each one, dates were written in fading ink: 1823, 1847, 1870-2, 1901, 1923, 1945, 1967, 1989. Every generation, every 20-odd years. Just like clockwork. The sound of footsteps in the hallway above made Elena freeze. Marcus was supposed to be at work for another 3 hours. She stuffed the photographs into her jacket pocket and crept toward the hidden passage that had become her secret entrance to the sealed room. The last thing she needed was to explain why she'd been exploring areas of the house he'd specifically warned her away from. But as she reached the narrow opening, a voice drifted down from upstairs. Not Marcus's voice. This one was older, raspier, tinged with an accent she couldn't place. "She's getting close, boy, too close." Elena's heart hammered as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall. Through the floorboards above, she could hear Marcus responding, but his words were muffled. The stranger's voice came clearer. "The bloodline must be preserved. The contract must be honored. You know what happens if we fail." Contract. The word sent ice through Elena's veins. She thought of the photographs in her pocket, of the patterns spanning generations. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't random. It was planned, orchestrated. Her grandmother's journal entries flashed through her mind, the rambling passages about feeding the hunger and keeping the family safe. She'd dismissed them as the confused writings of a deteriorating mind, but now... The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Elena gasped despite herself. The sound seemed to echo in the small space. Above, the voices stopped. Footsteps moved across the floor, deliberate and searching. Elena held her breath, pressing deeper into the shadows of the hidden passage. Through a crack in the wall, she could see a slice of the main corridor. Polished black shoes came into view, followed by the hem of a dark coat that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "She's here somewhere," the stranger murmured. "I can smell the child's blood. Strong, very strong." Elena's hand flew to her throat. The casual way he spoke of smelling her unborn baby's blood made her stomach lurch. She needed to get out, needed to run, but the only exit would take her directly past them. "Elena?" Marcus's voice called out, and she could hear the forced casualness in it. "Are you home, sweetheart?" The endearment that once made her feel safe now sounded like a trap. How long had he known? How long had he been part of whatever this was? More footsteps, and then Marcus appeared in her limited field of vision. Even from her hidden vantage point, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "The preparations are nearly complete," the stranger said, moving closer to Marcus. "The new moon is in 3 days. Everything must be ready." "She's not due for another month," Marcus protested, and Elena caught something in his voice. Reluctance? Fear? We agreed to wait until plans change. The stranger's voice cut like ice. The child grows stronger each day. If we wait much longer, it may be too powerful to contain. You know what happened to your Aunt Catherine when she tried to resist. Catherine. Elena's breath caught. Her grandmother had mentioned Catherine in the journal, something about her fighting back and paying the price. Elena had assumed it was another confused rambling, but now, I need more time to convince her, Marcus said. If she fights us, then we take her by force. The stranger's tone brooked no argument. The family has survived for 8 generations because we do what must be done. Your sentimentality will not be allowed to jeopardize everything. Elena felt the baby shift restlessly inside her, as if it too sensed the danger closing in. She pressed her other hand to her belly, trying to offer what comfort she could, while her mind raced through possibilities. The main entrance was out of the question. The back stairs were too exposed, but the tunnel system she'd discovered behind the sealed room, where did it lead? She began backing deeper into the passage, praying the old floorboards wouldn't creak and give her away. The binding ritual had begun the moment she'd opened that cursed door, Elena realized with growing horror. Every contraction, every surge of pain through her swollen belly was pulling her deeper into something ancient and hungry. The shadows in the sealed room writhed with anticipation, reaching for her with tendrils of darkness that seemed almost solid in the flickering candlelight. You can't fight what's already inside you, Grandmother Constance whispered from her position at the altar, her fingers dancing across symbols carved into bone. 5 generations of Blackwood women have fed the hunger. Your child will be the 6th offering. Elena pressed her back against the stone wall, feeling the cold seep through her nightgown. The baby kicked frantically inside her, as if it too sensed the malevolent presence growing stronger with each passing moment. She could feel something else stirring within her womb, something that wasn't entirely human anymore. The others tried to resist too, Constance continued, her voice taking on an otherworldly echo. Your great-great-grandmother Margaret thought she could break the covenant. She locked herself in the tower room for 3 days, praying and fasting, but when the time came, the hunger took what was owed. It always does. The portraits lining the walls seemed to shift in the candlelight, and Elena saw them clearly now. Generations of Blackwood women, all with the same hollow eyes, all holding infants that looked wrong somehow. Their babies' faces were too knowing, their tiny hands grasping at shadows that shouldn't exist. Another contraction ripped through Elena's body, stronger than before. She gasped and doubled over, feeling something shift inside her that had nothing to do with normal labor. The baby was moving, but not in the right way. It felt like it was reaching upward, toward her heart, with fingers that were too long and too sharp. What did you do to me? Elena managed between waves of pain. Constance smiled, revealing teeth that had grown pointed since Elena had last seen her clearly. The tea I gave you when you first arrived. Blessed herbs, I called them. They were blessed in a way, blessed by something far older than any god you might pray to. They prepared your child for what it needs to become. The shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming shapes that hurt to look at directly. Elena caught glimpses of something massive and writhing, with too many mouths and eyes that burned like dying stars. The entity her ancestors had made their pact with, the thing that had demanded payment in blood and innocence for over a century. Why? Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face as another contraction nearly brought her to her knees. Why our family? Because we were desperate, Constance said, her form beginning to flicker between human and something else. Your ancestor, Evangeline Blackwood, was dying of consumption, her husband dead, her children starving. She found the ritual in a book salvaged from a burned monastery. The entity offered her a bargain, eternal life for her bloodline, wealth and prosperity, but at a price. Every 5th generation, a child must be given freely to feed its hunger. Elena felt something wet and warm running down her legs, but when she looked down, it wasn't the clear fluid of broken waters. It was black as midnight and seemed to move with a life of its own, creeping across the floor toward the altar where Constance waited. The baby's coming, Constance said with satisfaction, and with it, the moment of choosing. You can give the child willingly, as is tradition, or you can fight and watch as the hunger takes not just your baby, but your soul as well. Either way, the covenant will be fulfilled. But Elena had been thinking, even through the pain and terror. She remembered the journal she'd found, the desperate scrawlings of her great-great-grandmother Margaret. The woman hadn't just tried to hide. She'd discovered something, a weakness in the ancient pact. "You're lying," Elena said through gritted teeth, forcing herself to stand despite the agony coursing through her body. Margaret didn't just resist. She found a way to turn the ritual back on itself. Constance's confident expression faltered for just a moment, and in that instant, Elena saw fear flash across her grandmother's inhuman features. "That's why you kept her journal hidden," Elena continued, pressing her advantage even as another contraction threatened to buckle her knees. "That's why you burned most of her papers. But you couldn't destroy everything, could you? Some truths are too powerful to erase completely." The entity's presence pressed against Elena's mind, trying to crush her will, but she held on to the knowledge she'd gleaned from Margaret's hidden writings. There was a way to break the covenant, but it would require sacrifice of a different kind, not innocent life, but something the darkness valued even more. The pain was becoming unbearable now, and Elena could feel the baby beginning its final descent. Time was running out, and everything depended on whether she had the strength to do what Margaret had tried, but failed to accomplish. The birthing chair loomed before Sarah like a monument to suffering, its dark wood stained with generations of blood and worse things she couldn't name. The carved symbols seemed to pulse in the candlelight, and she could swear she heard whispers emanating from the ancient grain itself. "It's time," Eleanor said, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. The elderly woman's eyes had taken on an unsettling gleam, as if she were no longer entirely herself. The convergence approaches, and the child must be born properly, as it has always been done. Sarah's hands instinctively went to her swollen belly. The baby had been restless all day, movements becoming increasingly violent as evening fell. Now, standing in this cursed room, she understood why. The child could sense what was coming. "I won't do it," Sarah said, backing toward the door. "Whatever sick ritual you're planning, whatever happened to the others, it ends with me." Eleanor's laugh was like dried leaves scraping against stone. "Oh, my dear child, you think you have a choice? You think any of us ever had a choice?" She gestured to the portraits lining the walls, generations of Blackwood women, all bearing the same haunted expression. "Do you see fear in their eyes or acceptance? They knew, as you must know, that some things are larger than our small desires." The candles flickered, and Sarah could have sworn she saw movement in the painted faces. Their eyes seemed to track her as she moved, lips parting as if trying to speak warnings from beyond the grave. "The Blackwood line carries a gift," Eleanor continued, approaching slowly like a predator stalking wounded prey. "But gifts come with prices. Our ancestors made a pact, power and prosperity in exchange for service. One child from each generation, given willingly to ensure the continuation of our covenant." "You're insane," Sarah whispered. But even as she said it, memories surfaced unbidden. Her grandmother's mysterious disappearance when Sarah was young. The way her mother would sometimes stare at nothing, tears streaming down her face. The family fortune that never seemed to diminish, despite no visible source of income. "Am I?" Eleanor pulled a leather-bound journal from her coat. "Your great-great-grandmother's diary. She wrote about the first time she entered this room, about what she learned." "Shall I read you the relevant passages?" Before Sarah could protest, Eleanor began reading in a sing-song voice. "The thing beneath the foundation grows stronger with each offering. Thomas showed me the contracts, signed in blood by my own ancestors. The children we give do not die exactly. They become something else, something necessary, and in return we are protected, provided for, kept safe from the ordinary misfortunes that plague common families." Sarah's blood ran cold. Children? Multiple children? One from each generation. Eleanor confirmed. Sometimes the firstborn, sometimes the second, the entity chooses, and it has chosen yours. As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed from somewhere deep beneath the mansion, a rhythmic pounding like an enormous heartbeat. The floorboards vibrated with each pulse, and Sarah felt her own heartbeat synchronizing against her will. "What is it?" she gasped, doubling over as a contraction seized her. The baby was coming, whether she willed it or not. Our benefactor, our protector, our master. Eleanor's voice had changed, becoming deeper, resonating with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. It has waited so patiently for this generation's gift. The bloodline grows thin. This may be our last offering. It must be perfect. The room seemed to expand and contract around them, walls breathing like living tissue. The portraits moaned in unison, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the painted women weren't just representations. They were windows, glimpses into wherever the sacrificed children had gone. "Look closer at the paintings," Eleanor commanded, and Sarah found herself unable to resist. In the backgrounds of each portrait, barely visible in shadow, were smaller figures. Children, dozens of them, their faces twisted in expressions of eternal anguish. Another contraction hit, stronger this time. Sarah fell to her knees, understanding with crystalline clarity that her body was no longer entirely under her control. The entity beneath the mansion was calling, and her child was answering. "It doesn't have to be painful," Eleanor said, suddenly gentle. "If you cooperate, if you embrace what you are, the transition can be peaceful. The child will serve a greater purpose, and you'll join the sisterhood. You'll understand finally why this is necessary." Sarah looked up at her with eyes blazing with determination. "No," she said through gritted teeth. "I'll die first." Eleanor smiled sadly. "Oh, my dear, death isn't an option. It never was." She opened the journal again, flipping to a page near the end. "Your mother tried to escape too. Shall I tell you how that worked out for her?" The screaming from the sealed room had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. Elena pressed her back against the hallway wall, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly as she felt the baby writhing violently within her. The ancient diary, clutched in her other hand, trembled as she read the final entries by the flickering candlelight. The ritual is complete. The 13th generation approaches. She who carries the bloodline must choose, sacrifice the child to break the curse, or let it be born and damn us all. The thing in the room feeds on the innocent. It has waited so long. Elena's breath came in short gasps as understanding crashed over her like ice water. The painted figures in the room weren't victims of some historical tragedy. They were her ancestors, trapped between worlds, bound to this place by their own desperate choices. And now she understood why her grandmother had left her the mansion, why the lawyers had been so insistent she come here before the birth. She was the 13th generation. The baby kicked hard, and for a moment Elena could swear she felt something else moving inside her, something that didn't belong. The temperature in the hallway plummeted, and she could see her breath misting in the air. Down the corridor, the door to the sealed room began to creak open wider, though no hand touched it. "No," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. The pull was too strong, the compulsion written into her very DNA. Her feet began moving of their own accord, carrying her back toward the threshold she had sworn never to cross again. The painted faces on the walls seemed to track her movement, their eyes following her progress with expressions of desperate hope and terrible warning. As she drew closer, she could hear them whispering, not with their voices, but directly into her mind. The words overlapped and intertwined until she couldn't tell where one ancestor's voice ended and another's began. "Don't let it be born. Save the child. Break the cycle. You cannot escape." Elena stopped at the doorway, her free hand gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles went white. Inside the room, the altar was no longer empty. A figure sat upon it, tall, draped in shadows that moved independently of any light source. Its face was a void, but she could feel its attention focused on her with the weight of centuries. "You came back," it said, and its voice was the sound of dry leaves and forgotten prayers. They always come back. "What are you?" Elena managed to ask, though her throat felt raw and tight. "I am what your family made me," the entity replied. "Fed by your guilt, sustained by your fear, bound by your choices. Each generation tries to end it, but they only make it stronger." The baby moved again, and this time Elena was certain. There was something else in there with her child, something that had been waiting, growing, preparing. Her grandmother's final letter had mentioned dreams, visions of things that weren't quite human. Now she understood. "The baby," she said, the words barely audible, "is mine as much as yours," the thing confirmed. "Your bloodline opened the door long ago. Now I claim what was promised." Elena's mind raced through the diary entries, searching for some solution her ancestors had missed. They had all faced this same choice, this same moment of impossible decision. Most had tried to run, a few had tried to fight, none had succeeded. But then she remembered something, a passage she had skimmed earlier, thinking it was just rambling. Her great-great-grandmother had written about the foundation of the house, how it had been built on ground that was already cursed, how the original sin wasn't her family's at all. "You're not bound to us," she realized aloud. "You're bound to this place." The shadow figure tilted its head, and for the first time, Elena detected something like uncertainty in its posture. "The curse isn't in our blood," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "It's in the house itself. That's why we keep inheriting it, why we're always drawn back. You need the house to maintain your hold on the physical world." The thing rose from the altar, its form stretching and warping until it nearly filled the room. "Clever girl. But what will you do with that knowledge? You cannot leave while you carry what is mine." Elena looked down at the diary, then at the painted faces surrounding them. Her ancestors stared back with expressions of dawning hope. She understood now what she had to do, what they had all been too afraid to attempt. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and dialed. "Hello? I need the fire department. My address is—" She paused, meeting the entity's void face directly. "And tell them to bring everything they have. The whole place needs to come down." The entity's roar shook the foundations, but Elena was already running. The basement trembled as Sarah pressed the ancient dagger against her palm, blood welling crimson against the silver blade. Above them, the mansion groaned like a dying beast, plaster raining down as the very foundation of the Blackthorn legacy began to crack. "Sarah, no!" Marcus lunged forward, but the spectral forms of her ancestors held him back with ghostly hands that burned like ice. Their hollow eyes reflected centuries of accumulated guilt, finally ready to pay the price for their sins. The entity writhed in its prison of salt and iron, its form shifting between the grotesque creature she'd first encountered and something far more ancient, a primordial darkness that had fed on Blackthorn blood for generations. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed, voice like grinding stone. "I am part of you now, part of the child." Sarah felt the baby kick frantically within her, as if sensing the supernatural battle raging around them. The movement reminded her of what she fought for, not just her own life, but the chance to break a cycle that had claimed too many innocent souls. "You're wrong," she whispered, raising the dagger higher. The blade caught the flickering candlelight, casting dancing shadows across the sealed room's walls. "You made one mistake. You assumed we were willing participants." The ghost of Eleanor Blackthorn stepped forward, her translucent form more solid now than Sarah had ever seen her. "The ritual requires willing sacrifice," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of a century's regret. "But it also requires the consent of the bloodline, all of us." One by one, the other spirits materialized more clearly, generations of Blackthorn women who had been forced into this unholy bargain. Sarah's grandmother stepped from the shadows, tears streaming down her ethereal face. "We never consented, child. We were trapped, bound by fear and ignorance. But together we can break these chains." The entity's roar shook the mansion to its core. Windows shattered throughout the house, and Sarah heard the distant crash of falling timber. "You will die! All of you will die, and the child will be mine. Sarah pressed the blade deeper into her palm, blood flowing freely now. But instead of fear, she felt a strange calm settling over her. Then we die free, she said simply. The blood hit the floor with a soft splash, and immediately the room filled with blinding light. The entity shrieked, its form beginning to dissolve as the willing sacrifice of uncorrupted blackthorn blood worked its ancient magic, not to bind, but to release. Marcus broke free from the ghostly restraints and rushed to Sarah's side, catching her as she swayed. "The baby," she gasped, feeling a sharp pain lance through her abdomen. But the entity wasn't finished. Even as its form dissipated, it gathered the last of its strength for one final assault. Dark tendrils shot toward Sarah's belly, seeking to claim what it had been promised for so long. Eleanor's spirit threw herself between them, taking the full brunt of the attack. She screamed as the darkness tore through her, but held firm. "Run," she cried. "The house is coming down." Sarah and Marcus stumbled toward the stairs as the basement collapsed behind them. The sealed room, that chamber of horrors that had held the family's darkest secret, crumbled into rubble, taking with it the altar, the symbols, and the last physical anchor the entity had to this world. They burst through the mansion's front door just as the entire east wing caved in with a thunderous crash. Sarah collapsed on the lawn, clutching her stomach as another wave of pain hit her. In the distance, she could hear sirens approaching. Neighbors must have called when the house began its violent death throes. "The baby's coming," she panted, looking up at Marcus with wide eyes. As the ambulance arrived and paramedics rushed to help her, Sarah caught one last glimpse of the mansion, where moments before it had stood as a monument to dark legacy. Now only ruins remained. But in those ruins, she saw something that made her smile through the pain. A soft, golden light emanating from where the sealed room had been, and within it, the peaceful forms of her ancestors finally moving on. The paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, and as they rushed toward the hospital, Sarah felt the baby shift again. But this time, the movement felt different. Free, clean, untouched by the supernatural taint that had plagued the Blackthorn line for generations. She had broken the curse, destroyed the entity, and saved her child. The Blackthorn legacy would continue, but it would be one of light, not darkness. As another contraction hit, Sarah smiled, knowing that whatever came next, her family was finally truly free.